You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS stopped working exactly 13 miles before I reached Whispering Pines Roadhouse. The screen just went black, like someone had reached through the glass and switched off reality itself. But I was desperate enough to keep driving, following the handwritten directions that had come with my acceptance letter, scrawled in spidery ink that seemed to shift colour in my peripheral vision. Connor Blackthorne. That's me. 29 years old, former bartender from Bangor, with a record clean enough to pass any background check, but dirty enough that most employers looked elsewhere. Nothing serious, just a few bar fights and one memorable incident involving a customer who insisted the drinks were speaking to him in ancient Greek. Turned out he was right, but that's another story entirely. The job posting had appeared on exactly 3 websites, all of them forums I'd never heard of before and couldn't find again afterward. Overnight caretaker needed for historic roadhouse, remote location, must be comfortable working alone, discretion essential, compensation exceeds industry standard. The phone number connected me to a voicemail system that played what sounded like wind through pine trees instead of a greeting. When I left my information, the callback came within the hour. The voice belonged to Jeremiah Thornfield, though he didn't give his name until later. His accent was unplaceable, old-fashioned but not quite New England, with consonants that clicked like settling timber. Our conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes, during which he asked no questions about my experience or qualifications. Instead, he wanted to know if I'd ever seen things that others couldn't, if I'd ever felt watched in empty rooms, if I believed that some places remembered what happened in them. I answered honestly to all 3, yes, yes, and absolutely. "You'll do nicely," he said, and I could hear his smile through the phone. "Be here before sunset on November 15th. The position begins immediately." That was 2 weeks ago. Now, driving through the growing darkness with a dead GPS and directions that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at the paper, I was starting to question my judgment. The fog rolled in as the sun touched the horizon, thick grey tendrils that seemed to move with purpose rather than wind. My headlights carved weak tunnels through the murk, revealing glimpses of towering pines that leaned inward over the road like curious giants. The trees were wrong somehow, too tall and too straight, their bark scarred with symbols that might have been natural growth patterns or might have been something else entirely. When I finally saw the roadhouse, I understood why the GPS had given up. This wasn't a place that existed on any modern map. It occupied a space between spaces where 3 abandoned logging roads converged in a clearing that felt older than the surrounding forest. The building itself was a massive log structure that had to date back to the 1800s, maybe earlier. Hand-hewn beams the size of telephone poles supported a roof lined with carved ravens, their obsidian eyes tracking my approach. The windows were thick green glass that distorted everything viewed through them, making the interior look like an underwater cavern. Jeremiah Thornfield was waiting for me on the wraparound porch, a wiry man in his 80s with silver hair pulled back in a leather cord, and hands covered in burn scars that formed intricate patterns across his palms and fingers. He moved with the fluid silence of someone who'd spent decades walking on floors that betrayed every footstep, his boots making no sound on the weathered planks. "Connor Blackthorne," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm pleased you could make it before full dark. We have much to discuss, and the night brings listeners." His pale eyes met mine for just a moment, long enough for me to see something ancient swimming in their depths. Then his gaze moved past me to the tree line, where shadows were gathering despite the absence of anything to cast them. Inside the roadhouse was a labyrinth of rooms, connected by narrow hallways lined with mounted antlers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, from creatures I couldn't identify. Some were white as old bone, others black as midnight, and a few seemed to be made from the materials that didn't quite look like horn at all. The main room was dominated by a massive stone hearth where a blue flame danced without any visible fuel, casting shifting shadows that moved independently of the firelight. The air smelled of pine smoke and something else, something organic and wild, that made the hair on my arms stand up. Underlying it all was a metallic scent like old blood and copper pennies. So faint, I might have imagined it if not for the way it made my mouth water with sudden, inexplicable hunger. "Your predecessor left unexpectedly," Thornfield said, leading me to a heavy wooden desk carved from a single enormous tree trunk. "Nathan Wells, good man, lasted almost 8 months, but the isolation wears on people differently, and some discover they're not suited for this particular type of work." He placed an ornate wooden box on the desk between us. The box was carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally, flowing into new configurations that suggested meanings I couldn't quite grasp. The wood itself was warm to the touch, almost feverish, and I could swear I felt a pulse beating inside it like a captured heart. "Inside this box are the protocols that have protected this roadhouse since its founding in 1798, Thornfield continued, his voice taking on the cadence of ritual recitation. "These rules must be observed precisely without deviation or interpretation. The wilderness remembers every broken promise, Mr. Blackthorne, and it does not forgive." He opened the box with a key that appeared in his hand as if conjured from air. Inside were 10 pieces of birchwood, each one carved with careful lettering that seemed to glow faintly in the blue flame's light. As he laid them out in a specific pattern, he explained each rule with the gravity of a priest reading last rites. "First," he said, pointing to a tablet carved with a flame symbol, "never extinguish the blue fire that burns in the stone hearth. Feed it pine needles every hour, exactly on the hour. The needles must be fresh, taken from the trees that grow within sight of the roadhouse. Use no other fuel, and never let the flame grow higher than your hand, or lower than your thumb." The second tablet bore the image of a door. "If someone knocks in patterns of 3, you must wait for the 4th knock before answering. If the 4th knock doesn't come within 60 seconds, do not open the door under any circumstances. Sometimes things test the boundaries." "Third," he continued, indicating a tablet with a rocking chair carved into its surface. "The rocking chair by the front window must never stop moving. Wind it every 2 hours using the brass key hanging beside it. The chair keeps time with something important, and if it stops, that something notices." The 4th tablet showed an owl in flight. "Serve no food after the owl calls 9 times consecutively. Count carefully. The owl knows when the hunting hours begin, and food draws the wrong kind of attention after dark." "Fifth," Thornfield said, his scarred fingers tracing the outline of animal eyes carved into the wood. "If a patron's eyes reflect light like an animal's, offer them raw meat from the icebox in the back room. Don't ask questions, don't act surprised. Some hungers are older than civilization." The 6th tablet depicted wind chimes. "Keep the chimes on the porch silent between midnight and dawn by tying them with red thread. They sing to things that shouldn't be called, and the night is full of eager listeners." I stared at the 7th tablet, which showed a collection of antlers surrounding a human figure. "Never count the antlers mounted on the walls," Thornfield said quietly. "Their number changes with the phases of the moon, and counting them draws the attention of their previous owners. Some debts transcend death." The 8th rule made my skin crawl. If the radio receives stations that don't exist, listen for exactly 3 minutes, then turn it off immediately. The broadcasts come from times and places that should remain lost. Too much exposure changes people. 9th, he said, pointing to a section of floor where heavy river stones were arranged in a perfect circle around what looked like a trapdoor. These 13 stones must remain exactly as they are. Count them twice each night, once at midnight and once at dawn. If the number changes, add or remove stones as needed to maintain 13. What lies beneath must stay beneath. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper for the final rule, represented by a tablet carved with trees and tiny human figures. Should anyone ask for directions to the old settlement, tell them it burned down in 1847. Nothing more, nothing less. The settlement is gone, and it must remain gone. I stared at the carved tablets, my rational mind struggling to process what I was hearing. Mr. Thornfield, these rules seem insane, he interrupted, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I thought the same thing when Ezra Blackwood explained them to me in 1967. He'd thought the same when Sarah Morrison taught them to him in 1923. The rules seem arbitrary because their purpose isn't immediately apparent to minds trained in linear thinking. He began gathering the tablets with reverent care. This roadhouse has operated safely for over 2 centuries by following these protocols exactly. We've had 43 caretakers in that time. 26 completed their terms and moved on to other pursuits. 17 did not. Something cold settled in my stomach. What happened to the 17? Thornfield's pale eyes met mine again, and this time I saw something that might have been pity. They decided the rules were suggestions rather than requirements. The wilderness claimed them one by one and became stronger for the feeding. Follow the protocols exactly, Mr. Blackthorne, and you'll see many sunrises. Ignore them. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. After he left, driving away in a truck that made no sound despite its obvious age, I stood alone in the main room and tried to convince myself I hadn't made a terrible mistake. The blue flame danced in its stone hearth, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move with purpose. The rocking chair creaked rhythmically by the window, its brass clockwork mechanism keeping perfect time with something I couldn't hear. And everywhere, the mounted antlers watched with the hollow gaze of dead things that remembered being alive. My first night was a masterclass in controlled terror. At exactly 8 p.m, I fed pine needles to the blue flame, gathering them from the trees just outside the front door. The needles crackled as they hit the fire, but instead of burning, they simply vanished, like they'd been absorbed into something hungry. The flame danced higher for a moment, almost like it was pleased, then settled back to its steady glow that cast no heat, despite its obvious luminosity. The rocking chair required winding every 2 hours, its brass key turning clockwork mechanisms hidden within the antique frame. The motion was hypnotic, a steady back and forth rhythm that seemed to match the cadence of a slow heartbeat. I found myself listening for whatever it was keeping time with, but heard only the whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional creak of settling timber. At 9:23, I heard my first test of the knocking rule. 3 sharp raps echoed through the roadhouse, each one perfectly spaced and identical in volume. I approached the heavy wooden door, my hand hovering over the iron latch, and began counting seconds. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant call of something that might have been an owl, but sounded too large and too aware. At 57 seconds, just when I was beginning to think the 4th knock wouldn't come, it arrived, softer than the others, almost apologetic, like whatever was outside knew it was asking for permission it didn't deserve. I opened the door to find my first customer, Mordecai Pine introduced himself with a voice like gravel in a mixer, a man who appeared to be in his 70s but moved with the fluid grace of someone much younger. He was dressed in patched furs and leather that looked hand-sewn, his beard reaching nearly to his belt and streaked with grey that seemed to shift colour in the blue flame's light. What struck me most were his eyes, pale blue and wild, like he'd seen too much of something no human was meant to witness. "Evening," he said, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. His breath created visible puffs of frost, despite the warmth inside the roadhouse. "Been walking the old paths tonight. Mind if I warm myself by your fire?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. He settled into a chair near the hearth and pulled out a small leather pouch, from which he extracted what looked unmistakably like gold teeth. Human teeth, from the size and shape of them, each one capped with precious metal that gleamed in the firelight. He placed 3 on the table as payment. "Whiskey," he said. "The good stuff Jeremiah keeps in the back room for special customers." I found the bottle he meant, noting how the label was written in a language that used symbols instead of letters, flowing script that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The liquid inside was amber, but seemed to contain tiny points of light that swirled like captured stars. As I poured, Mordecai spoke in his gravelly voice. "Been hunting the grey things tonight," he said, holding the glass up to the blue flame's light. "Tricky business, that. They learn your patterns quick, start hunting you back. But tonight was good hunting. Got 2 of them before they could slip back into the spaces between spaces." He drank his whiskey in a single swallow, then placed the empty glass on the table with a sound like breaking bells. "They're getting bolder though, coming closer to the roads, testing the boundaries. Something's got them stirred up, made them hungry for more than they usually take." I had no idea what he meant by grey things, but something about his tone made me believe every word. He gathered up his gold teeth payment and stood to leave, moving toward the door with that same fluid grace. "You're new," he said, pausing at the threshold. "Jeremiah always chooses well, but this place has a way of testing people. Follow the rules exactly, boy. Don't try to understand them. Don't try to improve them. Just follow them, and you might see spring." Then he was gone, dissolving into the fog like he'd never been there at all. The rest of the night brought a steady parade of visitors, each stranger than the last. Around midnight, Widow Crane arrived in a cart, pulled by something that moved like a horse but cast no shadow. She was a bent old woman, with fingers like twigs and eyes black as winter nights, carrying dozens of baskets woven from what looked disturbingly like human hair, in shades ranging from platinum blonde to deep black. She didn't speak, just arranged her baskets around the main room and began humming under her breath. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful but utterly alien, lullabies in a language that seemed to predate human speech. As she hummed, whispers emerged from the baskets, overlapping voices speaking of loss and longing, and memories that should have died with their owners. I served her hot tea in a cup she produced from one of her baskets, a delicate thing made from what looked like bone china, but felt warm and alive against my fingers. She paid with a handful of silver coins bearing faces I didn't recognize, their edges worn smooth by countless hands over countless years. Father Grimwald arrived near dawn, a gaunt man in black robes, who carried a walking stick carved from what was definitely not wood. His crucifix was made from the same pale material, intricately detailed and warm to the touch when he placed it on the bar while ordering black coffee. He spoke in whispered Latin between sips, prayers that made the blue flame flicker and dance with renewed vigor. "The barriers hold," he said to me as he prepared to leave, his voice carrying a peculiar accent that might have been Irish or might have been something older. "But they weaken with each passing season. The old agreements require constant maintenance, constant vigilance. You're part of that maintenance now, whether you understand it or not." Between visitors, I maintained the rules with growing unease. The pine needles vanished into the blue flame every hour, like they were being consumed by something invisible and ravenous. The rocking chair's clockwork never seemed to wind down completely, but I dutifully turned the brass key every 2 hours, listening to the hidden mechanisms whir and click with mechanical precision. The 13 stones around the trapdoor felt heavier each time I counted them, as if something below was pressing upward with increasing urgency. By my third night, I was starting to notice details that my rational mind wanted to dismiss as fatigue-induced hallucinations. Footprints appeared in the dust between my hourly rounds, boot prints and bare feet and things with too many toes that left marks like claw scratches in the wooden floor. The prints vanished when I returned, but their impressions remained in the dust like memories of visitors who hadn't quite finished leaving. Shadows moved independently of their sources, sliding along walls like living things with their own agendas. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that froze when I turned to look directly at them. The mounted antlers throughout the roadhouse seemed to multiply when I wasn't paying attention, though I carefully avoided counting them as instructed. Their hollow sockets tracked my movements with the patient hunger of predators waiting for the right moment to strike. The radio was perhaps the strangest element of all. It was an old tube model that should have received nothing but static this far from civilization, but every night it picked up broadcasts from stations that didn't exist. Voices speaking in dead languages about events that had never happened, weather reports for places that weren't on any map, and music that sounded like it had been recorded underwater by instruments made from human bones. Following the 8th rule, I listened for exactly 3 minutes each time before switching it off, but those brief windows into impossible broadcasts left me with fragments of knowledge I didn't want. Phone numbers for services that couldn't exist, addresses in cities that had never been built, and recurring advertisements for something called grey transit that promised to take passengers beyond the final destination. It was during my second week that I found Nathan Wells' hidden journal, and everything changed. I'd been exploring the woodshed behind the roadhouse, gathering pine needles for the constantly hungry blue flame, when I accidentally knocked over a stack of split logs while reaching for a particularly fresh-looking branch. Behind the fallen wood was a metal box, rusted but intact, secured with a padlock that opened at my touch like it had been waiting for me specifically. Inside were 3 items: a leather-bound journal, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding area, and a photograph that made my blood run cold. The photo showed the roadhouse as it appeared now, but the people in front of it were dressed in clothing from the 1800s. What made it disturbing wasn't the historical aspect, but the fact that several of the faces were people I'd already met. Mordecai Pine stood on the left, looking exactly as he did now. Widow Crane sat in her cart, surrounded by the same baskets she still carried. Father Grimwald stood with a group of other robed figures, his face unchanged by the passage of more than a century. Nathan Wells's journal explained everything and nothing at all. His early entries read like mine might have, full of confusion about the strange rules and growing unease about the unusual visitors. But as weeks turned to months, his tone shifted from bewilderment to understanding, then from understanding to a kind of terrified acceptance. Day 23, he'd written in careful block letters. The rules aren't arbitrary traditions. They're maintenance protocols for something much larger and more complex than I initially understood. Every hour I feed the flame, every time I wind that chair, every stone I count around the trapdoor, I'm maintaining a barrier that keeps 2 realities from bleeding into each other. Later entries revealed the truth about the roadhouse's purpose and the nature of its unusual clientele. The building sat at a convergence point, a place where the normal world touched something else, something older and hungrier that existed in the spaces between spaces. The visitors weren't exactly human, but they weren't monsters either. They were guardians of a sort, beings bound by ancient agreements to patrol the boundaries and keep worse things from crossing over. Mordecai has been hunting the grey things for over a century, Nathan had written. The grey things are what's left of the people from the original settlement, the ones who made the first bargain with the hungry dark. They're not alive and not dead, just trapped between states and growing more desperate with each passing year. Mordecai keeps them from spreading beyond the forest, but it's getting harder. There are more of them now, and they're learning. Further entries describe the other regulars in greater detail. Widow Crane wove the memories of the dead into her baskets, preventing the spirits of the grey things from possessing the living. Father Grimwald and his companions performed ongoing exorcisms and blessings that reinforced the roadhouse's protective barriers. Even the strange radio broadcasts served a purpose, acting as a kind of early warning system that alerted the Guardians to supernatural incursions from other dimensions. The roadhouse is neutral ground, Nathan had written, a place where the Guardians can rest and resupply, following agreements that predate written history. We're not just serving drinks and food. We're maintaining a supernatural way station that keeps the barriers between worlds stable. But it was the final section of entries that made my hands shake as I read them. Day 127. One of them isn't what they seem, I'm certain now. Someone comes here who doesn't belong, who asks the wrong questions, and watches too carefully. They're testing the barriers, looking for weaknesses in our defences. I think they're connected to the old settlement somehow. Maybe one of the grey things that learned to appear human. Day 134. It's Lillian Ashworth. Has to be. She's the only visitor who seems completely normal, and that's exactly what makes her suspicious. Too normal. Too interested in the operational details of the roadhouse. She's asked about the settlement 3 times now, and each time I give her the proper response. But she's persistent, wearing me down with casual conversation and seemingly innocent questions. Day 141. I'm getting tired. So tired of the constant vigilance, the hourly feedings, the endless maintenance of rules I barely understand. Sometimes I catch myself wanting to tell Lillian the truth about the settlement, just to see what would happen. That's how I know it's working, this erosion of my resolve. She's not just testing the physical barriers, she's testing me, waiting for the moment when exhaustion makes me careless. Day 148. I can't take it anymore. The isolation is driving me insane, and I'm starting to make small mistakes. Yesterday I almost counted the antlers, and this morning I was 3 minutes late feeding the flame. If I stay, I'll eventually make the mistake she's waiting for. I have to leave before I doom everyone. Jeremiah will find a replacement. He always does. Nathan's final entry was dated just 2 days before my arrival. Day 150, I'm leaving tonight. I've written instructions for my replacement hidden in places where only they will find them. The journal will end up in the woodshed because that's where it needs to be. The photograph will show them the truth about our visitors. And if they're smart, they'll recognize Lillian for what she is before it's too late. The settlement is still there, 3 miles northeast past the lightning-struck oak. Whatever bargain they made is still active, and they're still trying to break free. Don't let them. Whatever you do, don't tell them where they are. I closed the journal with trembling hands, finally understanding the true scope of what I'd gotten myself into. Nathan had been right about the visitors, right about the barriers, and probably right about Lillian Ashworth too. She'd been coming to the roadhouse for 3 weeks now, appearing every few nights with the regularity of clockwork. Lillian was a woman in her early 40s with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, dressed in practical outdoor clothing that suggested someone comfortable in wilderness settings. Unlike the other visitors, she seemed completely, reassuringly normal in every way. She always ordered the same thing, black coffee and whatever simple food I had available. She paid with modern currency, crisp bills that felt real and warm in my hands. Her reflection appeared correctly in every mirror and window, and she cast a single properly behaved shadow that moved exactly as shadows should. That complete normalcy should have been my first warning, but after dealing with visitors who defied natural law on a nightly basis, someone ordinary felt like a relief rather than a threat. "How long have you been working here?" she'd asked during her most recent visit, settling into the chair that offered the best view of both the trapdoor and the blue flame. "About a month now," I'd replied, pouring her usual coffee, still getting used to the routine. She'd smiled, and it seemed genuine. "It must get lonely out here. Do you ever wonder about the history of this place? I mean, it's such an unusual location for a roadhouse, so far from any major routes." I'd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold seeping through the walls. Mr. Thornfield mentioned it's been operating for over 2 centuries. Must have been a busy logging area back then. "I'm sure it was," she'd said, sipping her coffee with obvious enjoyment. "I've been researching the local history for a book I'm writing about forgotten communities in rural Maine. There are some fascinating stories about this area. Did you know there used to be a settlement not far from here?" My mouth had gone dry as the 10th rule flashed through my mind like a neon warning sign. "I think Mr. Thornfield mentioned something about an old settlement that burned down in 1847. Lillian's eyes had sharpened almost imperceptibly, a predator recognizing the scent of potential prey. "Burned down, you say? That's interesting. I've been through the county records pretty thoroughly, and I can't find any mention of a fire in 1847. Are you absolutely certain that's what he told you?" I forced myself to nod. "That's what he said. 1847, burned down completely. Nothing left but foundations, probably all grown over by now." She hadn't pressed the issue, but I caught her studying the antler-covered walls with new interest, her gaze lingering on the stones covering the trapdoor. When she'd left an hour later, she'd paused at the door with her hand on the latch. "You know, Connor, if you ever want to see where that old settlement used to be, I could show you. I've been mapping the area pretty extensively, and I think I've found the general location. It's really quite fascinating from a historical perspective." After she'd left, I'd sat in the rocking chair and tried to calm my racing heart. Nathan had been right. Lillian was testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses in both the physical defenses and my resolve. And like Nathan before me, I was starting to crack under the pressure. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and mounting paranoia. The supernatural visitors seemed more numerous and more agitated, as if they sensed approaching danger. Mordecai spoke of increased grey thing activity, his pale eyes darting constantly to the windows, as if expecting an attack. His hunting pack had grown from 3 to 7, silent figures in grey fur, who left no footprints in the snow, and communicated in hand signals that hurt to look at directly. Widow Crane's humming grew more frantic and her baskets multiplied until she could barely carry them all. The whispers emerging from them became more urgent, overlapping voices speaking of hunger and desperation and the growing weakness of ancient bindings. She began leaving offerings around the roadhouse, small bundles of herbs and bone that crackled with their own energy and made the blue flame dance higher when I passed near them. Father Grimwald arrived with increasing frequency, often accompanied by other robed figures who spoke in languages that predated Latin and carried implement that looked more like weapons than religious artifacts. Their prayers became desperate pleas in voices that echoed with harmonics no human throat should produce, and the very air around them shimmered with heat despite the growing winter cold. The roadhouse itself seemed to respond to the mounting tension. The blue flame required feeding more frequently, sometimes every half hour instead of every hour, consuming pine needles with a hunger that seemed almost sentient. The rocking chair's clockwork wound down faster, forcing me to wind it more often, and I could swear I heard whispered voices emerging from its hidden mechanisms during the brief moments between motion. The 13 stones around the trapdoor felt hot to the touch now, and sometimes I could hear scratching from beneath them, like fingernails, clawing at wood. The radio received more frequent broadcasts from impossible stations, voices speaking of invasion plans and resource allocation, and something called the Grey Convergence that was scheduled for the winter solstice. December arrived with the worst blizzard in 50 years, cutting off all access roads and leaving the roadhouse completely isolated from the outside world. That should have meant fewer visitors, but instead they came in greater numbers than ever before, seeking shelter from more than just the storm. Strange beings I'd never seen before emerged from the swirling snow. A woman made entirely of birch bark, who crackled when she moved and left curls of wood shavings wherever she walked. A man whose face was a constantly shifting vortex of autumn leaves, his voice like wind through empty houses when he ordered drinks that steamed without heat. Children who cast shadows of full-grown adults and spoke in perfect unison, with voices that harmonized in ways that made my teeth ache. They all seemed to be waiting for something, gathering for an event I didn't understand but instinctively feared. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste, metallic and sharp like the moment before lightning strikes. Conversation stopped when I approached, replaced by watchful silence that felt like being evaluated by a jury of monsters. It was on the winter solstice that everything went catastrophically wrong. The roadhouse filled with more entities than I'd ever seen at once, a supernatural convention that pushed the building's capacity to its limits. Mordecai arrived with his entire hunting pack, 13 silent figures in grey fur who positioned themselves strategically around the room like soldiers preparing for a siege. Widow Crane brought a wagon loaded with hundreds of baskets, each one humming with contained whispers that created an overlapping chorus of barely audible voices. Father Grimwald was accompanied by a dozen other priests, their robes bearing symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the blue flame's light. They carried objects that definitely weren't standard religious implements, things made from metal that reflected no light and wood that seemed to absorb heat from the air around it. Even stranger beings filled the remaining space. The birch bark woman stood in one corner, her surface covered in symbols that constantly rearranged themselves into new configurations. The leaf-faced man sat at the bar, his features cycling through expressions of every person who'd ever died in autumn. The shadow children gathered around the rocking chair, their adult shadows intertwining in patterns that suggested geometries my mind couldn't process. They all seemed to be waiting for something, a cosmic alignment or prophetic moment that would determine the outcome of conflicts I barely understood. The supernatural tension was so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin like invisible hands, and the blue flame danced higher than I'd ever seen it, casting writhing shadows that moved independently across the walls. That's when Lillian arrived, and I knew immediately that this was the moment Nathan had written about, the test that would determine whether I survived or joined the 17 caretakers who hadn't. She knocked 4 times without the usual pause, which should have been my warning. When I opened the door, she was covered in snow but not shivering, her cheeks flushed with excitement rather than cold. Behind her, barely visible through the swirling storm, I could see shapes moving in the forest, grey figures that stood just beyond the tree line, like an army waiting for orders. "Quite a gathering tonight," she said, stepping inside and surveying the assembled entities with obvious satisfaction. "Must be something special about the solstice." The room had gone completely silent, every supernatural being focusing their attention on our interaction with predatory intensity. The blue flame flickered dangerously, and I could hear the rocking chair's clockwork beginning to wind down, despite being at only half its normal interval. I poured her usual coffee with hands that trembled slightly, trying to focus on the rules, on maintaining the protocols that had kept this place safe for over 2 centuries. But the pressure was enormous. like standing at the bottom of an ocean trench with the weight of all that water pressing down from above. "Connor," Lillian said, settling into her usual chair with the casual confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the old settlement. You mentioned it burned down in 1847, but I've done extensive research since then." She pulled out a leather portfolio and spread historical documents across the table, maps and land surveys and census records that looked genuinely authentic. County records show several settlements in this area during the 1800s, but none that burned in 1847. One was abandoned in 1846 due to crop failures. Another was flooded when they built the Mill River Dam in 1923. But there's one settlement that just vanished. The assembled entities leaned forward as one, their attention focused on Lillian's words with laser intensity. The blue flame began to flicker more rapidly, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear an owl calling, its voice carrying an urgency that made my skin crawl. "No record of fire, flood, or disease," she continued, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality that made it hard to think clearly. "No graves in the local cemeteries, no mention in newspaper archives. It's like an entire community of over 200 people just stepped out of existence between one day and the next." The wind outside howled like something dying, and the radio crackled to life by itself, filling the room with static that almost sounded like whispered voices counting down from 13. The rocking chair finally wound down completely, its sudden silence more deafening than any scream. "I think I know where it was," Lillian said, leaning forward with predatory interest gleaming in her eyes. "About 3 miles northeast of here, past a lightning-struck oak tree that still stands despite being hit decades ago. There are still foundations there, covered by growth but still intact, stone cellars that go deeper than they should, and symbols carved into trees that predate any known Native American presence in the area." The assembled supernatural entities held their collective breath, and I realized that this was the moment of truth, the test that had broken 17 caretakers before me. Every instinct screamed at me to give her the prescribed answer, to stick to the script that had protected this place for over 2 centuries. But I was exhausted, bone deep, soul-crushing, tired from weeks of constant vigilance and supernatural terror. The isolation had worn me down to a raw nerve, and the pressure of maintaining rules I barely understood had pushed me to the breaking point. In that moment of perfect tension, with every eye in the room focused on my response, my defenses finally crumbled. "You're right," I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It's about 3 miles northeast, past the lightning-struck oak. But you shouldn't go there, Lillian. Something terrible lives in those ruins, something that should never be disturbed." The settlement didn't burn in 1847. It made a bargain that year, traded itself to something ancient and hungry. In exchange for power they couldn't control, they're still there, waiting for someone to show them the way back to the world of the living. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd doomed us all. The transformation didn't happen gradually. Lillian's carefully maintained human facade shattered like glass hitting concrete, revealing something that had been wearing her appearance like an ill-fitting mask. Her skin became bark rough and grey as old bone, developing deep furrows that wept black sap. Her eyes multiplied, opening like malevolent flowers across her cheeks and forehead, each one reflecting the blue flame like tiny mirrors filled with starlight and malice. When she smiled, her mouth split wider than any human mouth should, extending almost to her ears and revealing row after row of teeth made from splinters of white wood, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Her fingers elongated into twig-like appendages that ended in thorns instead of nails, and her hair transformed into writhing vines that moved with their own predatory intelligence. "Finally," she said, her voice now a chorus of whispers like wind through dying leaves, each word spoken by a dozen throats in perfect, horrifying harmony. Finally, someone tells the truth. Do you have any idea how long we've been waiting? How many caretakers have come and gone, each one eventually broken by the isolation and pressure until they made the mistake we needed? The roadhouse's protective barriers began failing immediately, reality unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart thread by thread. The blue flame turned black as midnight, then guttered out entirely, plunging the room into darkness lit only by Lillian's multiple eyes and the phosphorescent glow beginning to emanate from the assembled entities. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and frost began forming on every surface despite the absence of windows or doors being opened. The rocking chair exploded into splinters, its clockwork mechanism scattering across the floor in a cascade of broken gears and springs that chimed discordantly as they struck the wooden boards. The wind chimes outside broke free of their red thread bindings simultaneously, ringing out an alarm that seemed to wake every sleeping thing in the forest for miles around. But worst of all was the trapdoor. The 13 riverstones cracked and crumbled as something immense pressed upward from below. The weight so enormous that the wooden floorboards splintered and warped. The iron hinges screamed in protest as the door bulged upward, and through the growing gaps came a sound like the ocean breathing, rhythmic and vast and utterly alien. The supernatural entities in the roadhouse reacted with a mixture of panic and grim determination. Mordecai and his hunting pack drew weapons that gleamed with their own cold light, curved blades that seemed to be forged from captured moonbeams, and handles wrapped in leather made from things that had never been animals. They formed a defensive perimeter around the failing trapdoor, but I could see the fear in their wild eyes. Widow Crane's baskets split open like rotten fruit, releasing centuries of contained whispers into the air. The voices overlapped and intertwined, creating a cacophony of desperate pleas and warnings in languages both living and dead. Some spoke of hunger that could never be satisfied, others of bargains made in desperation and regretted for eternity. A few whispered my name with familiar voices, and I realized they were the previous caretakers who'd failed this same test. Father Grimwald and his companions began a prayer in the old tongue, their voices rising desperately against the growing chaos, but their words seemed to have no effect on whatever was rising from beneath the roadhouse. If anything, their holy symbols began to smoke and blacken, the sacred metal corroding as if exposed to some cosmic acid. Through it all, Lillian laughed, with the sound of entire forests dying, her multiple eyes focusing on me with terrible amusement. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her form continuing to shift and flow like smoke given substance. "The settlement never died, Connor. We just learned to be patient. We learned to wait, to send scouts like me, to test the barriers, to wear down the Guardians until they made the mistakes we needed." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with the full scope of my error. Nathan's journal had been wrong about one crucial detail. The roadhouse wasn't meant to keep the settlement's remnants out. It was meant to keep something much worse contained beneath it, and I'd just handed them the key to their prison. "This roadhouse was built on the bones of our original sacrifice," Lillian continued, her voice echoing now from the pit below, as much as from her shifting mouth. "In 1798, our ancestors made a bargain with the hungry dark, trading their humanity to gain power over death itself. But the bargain came with conditions. We had to remain hidden, contained beneath the earth until someone spoke our true location aloud. Only then could the binding be broken." The trapdoor finally gave way completely, revealing a shaft that descended into absolute darkness. From that darkness came a presence so vast and alien that my mind refused to process it directly. I could only perceive it in fragments, the suggestion of movement larger than buildings. the sound of breathing that shook the earth beneath my feet, the sense of ancient intelligence that regarded human consciousness, the way we might regard the thoughts of insects. Every caretaker eventually breaks, Lillian said, her form now more plant than human, roots and vines spreading across the floor to anchor her to the building itself. 17 before you, each one weakening the barriers a little more, with their small mistakes and growing desperation. But you, Connor, you were special. You gave us exactly what we needed. Grey figures began emerging from the pit, climbing up from depths that seemed to extend far beyond what should have been possible beneath a simple roadhouse. They were the original settlers, but transformed by centuries of contact with whatever they bargained with. Their skin was the colour of old mushrooms, translucent enough to show the dark fluid that flowed through their veins instead of blood. Their eyes were black voids that reflected nothing, and when they moved, they left trails of phosphorescent mould that glowed with sickly bioluminescence. As they climbed, they spoke in unison with voices like rustling leaves, reciting the terms of their ancient agreement. We who traded flesh for permanence, warmth for wisdom, life for the power over death. We who dwelt beneath the earth until the words were spoken that would set us free. We who hunger for the world above and the warm blood that flows within it. The supernatural guardians fought desperately to contain the breach, but they were vastly outnumbered. Mordecai's hunting pack cut down grey figures by the dozen, but for everyone they destroyed, 3 more emerged from the pit. Widow Crane wove new bindings from her hair, trying to reseal out the opening, but the grey things tore through her barriers like cobwebs. Father Grimwald's prayers grew more frantic, but his god seemed to have no power over beings that had voluntarily traded away their souls. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The supernatural entities were fleeing through windows and walls, abandoning the roadhouse to whatever was rising from beneath. But as I reached for the door, Lillian's vine-like appendages wrapped around my ankles, holding me in place with impossible strength. "Oh no, Connor," she said, her multiple eyes glittering with malevolent joy. "You don't get to leave. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. Every caretaker who breaks the barriers becomes part of the settlement." Another voice in our collective consciousness. I could feel something changing inside me, a cold spreading from where her vines touched my skin. My vision began to shift, colours becoming muted while shadows gained depth and definition. The grey figures climbing from the pit no longer looked monstrous. They looked like neighbours, like family members welcoming me home after a long journey. "The hunger is beautiful once you stop fighting it," Lillian whispered, her voice now coming from inside my own head. "The endless appetite for life and warmth and the vital essence that flows through all living things. You'll understand soon enough." But as my humanity drained away, I remembered Nathan's final hiding place. He'd mentioned writing instructions for his replacement, hidden in places where only they would find them. With my last coherent thought, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the box of matches I'd been carrying since my first night. If I couldn't save myself, maybe I could prevent this from spreading beyond the roadhouse. I struck a match and threw it onto the spilled pine needles that had been feeding the blue flame. The needles caught fire immediately, but instead of normal flame, they burned with the same cold blue light that had been contained in the hearth. The fire spread rapidly across the floor, following trails of sap that had leaked from the emerging grey things. Lillian shrieked in a voice like breaking timber as the flames reached her root system. The blue fire was somehow different from normal combustion, burning cold instead of hot, and consuming the supernatural infections that were spreading through the building. Where it touched the grey figures, they simply dissolved like smoke, their phosphorescent glow fading to nothing. "You don't understand," Lillian screamed, her human facade completely abandoned now as she revealed her true form. She was enormous, a twisted tree thing, with a trunk the size of a redwood, and branches that scraped the ceiling. "The settlement needs to feed. We've been contained for over 2 centuries and the hunger has grown beyond bearing. If we don't spread now, we'll consume ourselves. But the blue flames were spreading faster than her infection, racing up the walls and across the ceiling with supernatural speed. The fire consumed the mounted antlers, each one dissolving into sparkles of light that joined the growing conflagration. The grey things tried to flee back into the pit, but the flames followed them down, turning their escape route into a chimney that drew the cold fire deeper underground. I felt Lillian's vines releasing me as her attention turned to self-preservation, but it was too late. The cold fire had already touched the infection she'd planted in my system, burning away the alien influence with surgical precision. My vision cleared, colours returning to normal as the grey thing's influence faded from my perception. The roadhouse burned for hours, but the blue flames consumed only the supernatural elements, while leaving the basic structure intact. When dawn finally came, I found myself standing in the main room, surrounded by charred remains of what had once been the settlement's invasion force. The pit was sealed with what looked like natural stone, as if it had never existed. The mounted antlers were gone, leaving empty walls that felt somehow cleaner, lighter. Jeremiah Thornfield found me there 3 days later, sitting in the restored rocking chair beside a hearth where normal orange flames now danced cheerfully. He looked older than when I'd first met him, his silver hair now completely white, and new lines etched deeply around his pale eyes. "The barriers held," he said simply, settling into a chair across from me. "Barely, but they held. The settlement has been permanently contained, their bargain finally voided by the destruction of their anchor point." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You knew this would happen." "I suspected," he admitted. "The cycles were getting shorter, the pressure building faster with each new caretaker. Something had to give eventually. I just hoped it would be the settlement's bindings rather than our defences. And if I'd failed completely? If they'd escaped?" Thornfield's expression grew grim. Then the infection would have spread beyond the forest, creating new settlements wherever they fed. Within a decade, half of New England would have been consumed. Within a century, perhaps the entire continent. He pulled out a new wooden box, similar to the one that had contained the original rules, but somehow different, cleaner. "The roadhouse still serves its purpose, but the protocols have changed. The immediate threat is gone, but there are other convergence points, other places where reality grows thin. Would you be interested in learning about them?" I looked at the box, then at the restored roadhouse around me, and finally at my own hands. They looked normal, human, but I could still remember the feeling of something alien trying to take root in my consciousness. I'd come within minutes of becoming something that would have devoured every living thing it encountered. "What happened to the previous caretakers?" I asked. "The ones who failed their tests?" "They became part of the settlement," Thornfield said quietly. "Their voices joined the collective consciousness, their memories absorbed into the hungry dark. But when you burned out the infection, you freed them as well. They finally found peace." As if in response to his words, I heard whispers on the wind outside, faint voices saying farewell and thank you before fading into silence. 17 souls, finally free from their supernatural prison. "I'll stay," I said, reaching for the box. "Someone needs to watch the barriers, and I think I understand now what that really means." Thornfield smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, it reached his eyes. "Excellent. The new protocols are much simpler than the old ones. No more feeding mysterious flames or counting stones around trapdoors. Just standard maintenance with a few special considerations for the more unusual visitors." He opened the box to reveal 5 simple wooden tablets, each one carved with straightforward instructions that actually made sense. The roadhouse would continue to serve as neutral ground for the supernatural guardians, but without the constant threat of catastrophic failure hanging over every interaction. As Thornfield prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "By the way, Connor, you should know that your actions have earned you a certain reputation among the Guardians. They're calling you the Flame Bearer, the one who burned away the grey infection. Some of them will want to meet you properly, now that the crisis has passed." After he left, I sat alone in the restored roadhouse and tried to process everything that had happened. I'd taken a job as a simple caretaker and ended up saving New England from supernatural invasion. The isolation that had nearly broken me had also provided the desperate courage needed to set fire to an ancient evil. That evening, as I was learning to work with the new, simpler protocols, I heard a familiar knock at the door. 4 raps, perfectly spaced, followed by a pause and then a 5th knock that sounded almost cheerful. I opened the door to find Mordecai Pine. But he looked different now. Younger somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. His pale eyes held warmth instead of wildness, and when he smiled, it was with genuine relief rather than predatory hunger. "Evening, Flamebearer," he said, stepping inside with none of his previous supernatural stealth. "Thought you might like to know that the grey thing population has dropped to 0 for the first time in over 2 centuries. The forest is finally clean." He produced a bottle of whiskey from his pack, but this time it was normal alcohol with a label I recognised. Figured we should drink to that, and to new beginnings. As we sat by the restored hearth, sharing drinks and stories of the battle that had raged 3 nights ago, I realised that the roadhouse felt different now. Lighter somehow. The oppressive weight of ancient evil had been lifted, replaced by something that felt almost hopeful. Other visitors began arriving as the night wore on. Widow Crane came with a single basket now, containing flowers instead of whispered memories. Father Grimwald arrived alone, his crucifix gleaming with polished silver rather than bone, speaking prayers of thanksgiving rather than desperate pleas. Even the strange beings from the solstice returned, but they appeared more human now, their supernatural elements muted and non-threatening. They all wanted to hear the story of how I'd discovered the Blue Fire's true purpose, how I'd realised that the pine needles weren't feeding something evil, but actually charging a defensive system that had been weakened by centuries of careful rationing. The flame had been hungry not for supernatural fuel, but for enough energy to completely sterilise the settlement's infection when the moment came. "Nathan knew," Mordecai said as the evening wound down. "He figured it out near the end, left clues for you to find. The journal, the photograph, even the hiding place in the woodshed. He was preparing you for the choice you'd have to make." "What choice?" I asked. "Whether to save yourself or save everyone else," Widow Crane said in a voice like rustling leaves, but warm leaves now. Autumn instead of decay. "You chose well, Flamebearer. The forest remembers, and so do we." As the visitors departed into the night, leaving through the front door like normal customers, rather than dissolving into mist or shadow, I realised that I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for. Purpose, community. A place where someone like me, someone who saw things others couldn't, actually belonged. The roadhouse would continue operating, serving as a way station for the Guardians who protected the boundary between worlds. But now it felt like a place of healing rather than barely contained disaster, a sanctuary where beings who'd spent centuries fighting in the shadows could finally rest and recover. I still maintain the protocols, but they're sensible now. Keep the fire burning with normal wood instead of mystical pine needles. Wind the rocking chair because it's an antique and the mechanism needs regular maintenance. Count the stones around what used to be a trapdoor, because organisation is important, not because reality will unravel if I miscount. And every few nights I get visitors who no longer feel like barely contained monsters, but like colleagues, fellow guardians, working to keep the world safe from things that should remain hidden. We shared drinks and stories in the comfortable silence of people who understand each other's burden. Sometimes late at night when the fire burns low and the forest settles into quiet sleep, I think about the 17 caretakers who came before me. They'd all faced the same impossible choice, worn down by isolation and supernatural pressure until they broke under the weight of rules they didn't understand. I wonder if any of them could have made the same choice I did, given the knowledge and preparation Nathan had provided. Maybe they could have. Maybe the cycle of failure was always meant to lead to this moment, each broken caretaker weakening the settlement's defences until someone finally had the opportunity to end the threat permanently. Maybe their sacrifice wasn't meaningless after all, but part of a larger plan that took over 2 centuries to come to fruition. I'd like to think so. I'd like to believe that Nathan Wells and the 16 who came before him were heroes rather than victims, guardians who held the line long enough for the right person to arrive at the right moment with the right knowledge to finally win an ancient war. The roadhouse sits quiet now in the pre-dawn darkness, its lights visible for miles through the forest as a beacon for travellers, both mundane and supernatural. But it's no longer a fortress barely holding back catastrophe. It's a home, a place where strange and wonderful beings can find rest and refuge in a world that doesn't understand them. And I'm its keeper, the flame bearer who burned away an ancient evil and learned that sometimes the most important rule is knowing when to break all the others. The sun will rise soon, painting the snow-covered pines in shades of gold and crimson. The roadhouse will welcome another day of ordinary magic and extraordinary friendships. And somewhere in the peaceful forest around us, nothing grey moves in the spaces between the trees. The hungry dark has been fed its last meal, and the settlement sleeps forever beneath stones that will never move again. The bargain is broken, the debt is paid, and the world above remains bright and warm and beautifully, wonderfully alive. This is my story, told in my own words, of how I came to work the night shift at Whispering Pines Roadhouse and learned that some rules are worth dying for, while others are worth breaking to truly live.